inviting me to be here today. So the question about can Marxism explain women's oppression? Over the last decade, I think one of the charges that has been labelled at Marxism is that, particularly by both activists and indeed by academics, is that it either ignores or downplays the question of oppression. There's a kind of, I think, widespread idea in society that today's society consists of a kind of series of separate, but if you like, kind of overlapping identities that are based on things like our gender, our sexuality, our race, our class, our national or our cultural identity. And it's, I kind of think, a widespread and an idea that's, I think, quite encouraged, particularly in terms of academia, and that we all have different identities, and that there's kind of multiple ideas that sometimes intersect. And there's a kind of very trendy notion in academia at the moment called intersectionality, which is about the idea that you can be oppressed because of your race, your class, your gender, and that all of these things kind of intersect together. And that Marxism in particular is sort of castigated for being unable to explain these, or prioritising. In particular, it's heavily criticised for prioritising class. That the critics argue is that all Marxists really care about is class, and that things like gender, racial or sexual oppression are just considered secondary. And I want to argue against that, and I want to argue that the question is not that when we want to talk about the question of oppression, and specifically in this meeting we'll be talking about women's oppression, it's not so much that it's not that Marx and Engels privileged class over other forms of oppression, but that they argued that various oppressions cannot be understood separately from capitalism or from class society, because capitalism shapes and it in many ways depends on its survival for, in particular, the oppression of women. Secondly, they argue that the struggle against oppression cannot simply be carried out on the basis of the struggle of a single oppressed group that is united across class lines, because such a struggle will always be limited by the narrow interests of the kind of bourgeois or kind of middle class elements within that oppressed group, which will inevitably seek to kind of limit the scope of the struggle and keep it within the confines of capitalism. So it's not that that when Marx and Engels put such an emphasis on class, it's not that they argued that the working class are the most oppressed group in society. In fact, in many societies, workers were far from the least oppressed groups in society. But that they argued, as we mentioned in the last meeting, that the working class is the only class that is collectively able to challenge capitalism, and that oppressions like your sexual, gender, racial oppression is very much rooted in the system of capitalism. And I want to look at that, particularly focusing on contemporary capitalism and the question of women's oppression, and to look at how, if we want to challenge the oppression of women and other forms of oppression in society, because they are centred around the system of capitalism, they are constructed within capitalism, that we need to work together collectively within the working class to challenge oppression, yes, but to challenge the system that creates that oppression. And it's only by challenging capitalism can we actually achieve real liberation. So what I think is very important to begin with is to look at, and I'm not going to have time to really go into this in a great deal of detail, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit more in the discussion, but I do think it's a point worth making, is that what both Marx and Engels do is that they situate the origins of women's oppression in the rise of class society. And I think that was a very, very important contribution to the understanding of women's oppression, because historically, and indeed I think it continues today among most kind of mainstream feminists, argue that women's oppression is related in a kind of trans-historical, ahistorical category called patriarchy. And it's the idea that, sexism, the oppression of women, is fixed for all time because of various things like human biology, that women and men are fundamentally different and that their biological differences and that oppression is an expression of those biological differences, or that it's something that's rooted in people's heads, or that, well, women have been, from the very, very beginnings of society, women have always been oppressed. And there's this kind of, kind of slightly kind of Flintstone-ish explanation sometimes of kind of women's oppression. That sort of idea of the kind of caveman dragging the woman by her hair in and out of the cave. That sort of is the kind of typical explanation, even though there is no historical basis for this. And I think Engels made a very important contribution in actually drawing on some of the anthropological evidence and study that was emerging in the 19th century, and looking that in pre-class societies, men and women lived in relatively egalitarian communities where there wasn't there wasn't a very sort of there wasn't these kind of there were sometimes for organizational reasons there was divisions of labor. Men tended to hunt because it involved leaving the kind of the collective communities and going off sometimes for days or weeks to provide to hunt for meat, where women, because they were often breastfeeding and because they were taking care of children, and they tended to stay closer to the kind of communal camp, and they were involved in the more in the gathering of kind of nuts and berries and things like that, which was very important to the survival of the community, because people didn't live in nuclear families. They lived in kind of rough groups of about 20 to 30 individuals. Because the gathering of the fruit and nuts was actually the most stable form of food often for these communities, that women played a very, very vital role in those communities. And there's lots of anthropological evidence that has developed even since Engels' time that show that in those early pre-class societies that men and women did live in relatively speaking equality. Now, I don't think you can sort of romanticize that, because life was very, very tough. Life was very, very brutal in these times. So it's not a case of romanticizing those sort of communities, but it is about saying that there's not some sort of biological or psychological desire within men to sort of to dominate women, that it's not part of human nature, which is sometimes the kind of explanation that we see sometimes in feminist theory. It's the rise of class society, and the women's status within society becomes rooted within the family that gives rise to the oppression of women. Now, that's a slightly abbreviated explanation, but I think it's just important to note that it is the rise of class society that we see the development of women's oppression, and that oppression under capitalism manifests in very particular ways. And also, as I hope to show in the remaining time that I've left, that women's oppression is not just an element of capitalism, but it's actually central to capitalism itself. If we want to understand the nature of women's oppression, we need to understand, I think, the nature of capitalism today, and why women continue to be oppressed under capitalism. Because if you think about it, in the 40 years or so since second wave feminism, since the women's movement of the 1960s and 1970s, on one hand, there has been quite dramatic changes in women's lives. The women's movement, sort of broadly speaking, was very successful in bringing down many of the kind of formal barriers to equality, in terms of kind of legal challenges to the inequality that's built into the law, and to fighting for things like equal pay. And in a relatively short period of time, the lives of women have been quite dramatically transformed. So I just think in terms of my own life compared to that of my mother's, our lives are dramatically different. Women are now a permanent presence in the workforce. It's unusual now for a woman to stay at home and not work, whether full-time or part-time, in some form outside of the home. Women occupy powerful positions in the world of business and politics. The head of the International Monetary Fund is the former French finance minister, Christine Lagarde. They're in the United States at the moment. Two of the leading candidates for president following Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton and Elizabeth Warren, are both women. There have been real changes in women's lives in terms of sexual freedom. Women now have multiple sexual partners. They have children not when they get married, but they often have children as single parents. There's access to divorce. In many countries, apart from my own, there is access to abortion, and it's not as rigorously controlled as it is in Irish society. But in some ways, when you kind of think about feminism, or certainly if you study feminism in college, it's kind of framed as this kind of, or constructed as this kind of narrative of progress, so that things are gradually getting better all the time. And there are perhaps some kind of niggling inequalities that are remaining, but if to use Sheryl Sandberg's phrase, lean in, if women would only lean in or try harder, that would be quickly overcome. But at the same time, even though there has been tremendous gains, those gains in many ways have been quite contradictory. So that in many ways, why women are expected to, why women are able to work outside the home, they're also expected to work outside the home and to have a job and also to take care of the family. So it now becomes a kind of almost kind of balancing act in that they're expected to do almost kind of twice the amount of work. In things that women have fought for in terms of their liberation around their sexuality and their freedom to choose, that is something that capitalism has commodified and turned into a brand, into something that can be bought and sold. I think probably best expressed by that dreadful L'Oreal slogan, "Because I'm worth it," which is this sort of idea that you can purchase your liberation, you can celebrate your liberation as a liberated woman, you can buy the self-esteem enhancing shampoo or lipstick. Why? Because you're worth it. And it kind of celebrates this. And one of the things that capitalism has done very well is that it has sort of commodified and sold the whole vocabulary of women's liberation and women's empowerment, and used that to sell stuff back at women. There is a kind of, in one hand, we live in a sort of kind of hyper-sexualized society, particularly for women. So that right to be seen as a kind of sexual being is again something that has been commodified, something that has been turned in the marketplace to something that can be bought and sold. And what started off as a kind of open, emancipatory embrace of one's sexuality. Young women now talk about the enormous pressure that they feel to behave in a sexualized manner. That it's almost like at all times in your life you're expected to be sexual. You're supposed to worry about your sexual attractiveness at every moment of your life. I was just reading, on the newspaper on the plane over this morning, and there was it was one of those kind of Saturday kind of feature pieces, which was castigating women who spent all their money on worrying about what they looked like outside of the house, and were going around in their pajamas and slippers at home, and weren't kind of thinking about the fact that they should be giving time to their personal care within the home. So not only when you go outside you have to worry about how you look, you also apparently should be more worried about how you look when you're at home, cleaning the dishes or looking after the kids as well, because it is all about giving you confidence and feeling like you can do it. And we hear this sort of language all the time of the kind of the self-empowerment. And if you think back to the to one of the key slogans in the women's movement in the 1960s was "the personal is political." It seems now, under kind of neoliberal capitalism, is that the personal is the only political that we're allowed to have. Is that to be a woman is all about you as an individual and your personal expression of who you are and what it is to be an empowered and sexualized woman in the 21st century. And there's a whole kind of plethora of kind of self-help books and that to kind of help you along the line. Not least the one I mentioned there earlier is the Sheryl Sandberg. She's the chief operating officer of Facebook and has written this book and has a website, and there's a whole kind of series of events, and you can go and you can pay $1,000 to go and listen to her tell you how to empower yourself. And I just want to just read very quickly just one of the kind of, I think just one of the better one of the most, I think, kind of one of the quotes that kind of sums up her argument. So she talks about she starts off by talking about the undeniable fact that in positions of authority, political and in the business world, they tend to be dominated by men. There are some, of course, some notable exceptions, but she seeks a kind of explanation for that, and her explanation, again, is in the personal. And this is what she says. She says, "We hold ourselves back in ways both big and small, by lacking self-confidence, by not raising our hands, and by pulling back when we should be leaning in. We internalize the negative messages we get throughout our lives, the messages that says it's wrong to be outspoken, aggressive, more powerful than men. We lower our own expectations of what we can achieve. We continue to do the majority of the housework and the childcare. We compromise our career goals and make room for our partners and children who may not even exist yet." And in some ways, I think that passage, probably for a lot of women, probably has some resonance, because it is true that women are socialized not to speak up, they're not socialized to be assertive, and to make demands. But her emphasis, and this emphasis continues throughout the book, is an emphasis on the personal choices that women make. So that at the end of the day, if you want to look at, if you feel like you're not in a good job, or you're not earning enough, or you're very stressed out, the answer to the problem is you yourself. And the answer, the solution to the problem, is to look inside yourself and to change not the system, but to change you yourself, that you are holding yourself back. And her solution is summed up in the slogan that she says, "Lean in." And she's kind of got she's got a whole series of these women in often these kind of high-tech corporate groups to kind of join in on this kind of lean in project that she talks about, how she wants to empower the whole women throughout the world. And one of the other women that she has in is on this project is a woman called Melissa Mayers, who was the first engineer hired by Google, and she about 3 years ago she was recently hired to be the CEO of Yahoo, another one of those internet companies which was undergoing a series of restructuring. And she made the news because at the time when she went for the interview, she was 6 months pregnant, and Yahoo hired her anyway. And she, there was a lot of kind of song and dance about this in the media. And again, it was a sort of celebrated as, look, women have arrived, women have achieved. You can be pregnant, you can be 6 months pregnant and still hired to be the CEO of a big internet company. But what transpired later was that when she had her baby and she returned to work something like 3 weeks afterwards, was that she, in her office, next door to her big office, they had a separate office where she had her 2 nannies looking after the baby, so beside her in the office, and she could see the baby all day. Now, I'm sure lots of women might want to return to work 3 weeks if you could have 2 nannies in the office next door looking after your baby. And secondly, one of the things that she did to restructure Yahoo was to end telecommuting and to working at home, where a lot of women in Yahoo would work some of the time at home and some of the time in the office. And one of the first things she did in the restructuring was to fire a huge number of part-time employees, the majority of whom were women, and also to bring in this restructuring that so a lot of women have to give up their jobs because they couldn't afford the costs of childcare. Last week it was announced that Facebook and Apple were going to allow women they were going to pay for women to freeze their eggs so that they could have children, presumably at a more convenient time for Apple and Facebook, because they didn't like when women were having children in their 20s. But it was interesting when I was just looking at some of the kind of and they were saying, Apple were saying, oh, we give a generous maternity package and things like that. And yes, they do. But most women in survey after survey will say that the most significant thing for them in terms of working outside the home is access to childcare. Most women would like on-site childcare, where where there's a creche in offices, and this is, quite possible certainly for these big kind of multinational corporations. Neither Facebook nor Apple have on-site childcare. Facebook has on-site doggy daycare. You can bring your dog to work because you couldn't possibly go to work and leave your dog behind you, but you can't bring your child to work. You can't find on-site site childcare. So there's a whole kind of host of kind of contradictions here. And again, it is all about the solutions to all of these problems are seen as personalized solutions. And what is ignored within this, within kind of the resurgence of interest in mainstream feminism that tends to focus quite a lot on the kind of on the recognizability of women and of high-powered women in society, is what it ignores is the kind of structural explanations for why women continue to earn less than men, continue to do predominantly part-time work, and why there continues to be huge levels of sexism in society. So certainly there's a resurgence of interest in feminism, in things like Everyday Sexism and other such sites, and kind of internet blogs like Jezebel and Wham and all of these that talk a great deal about women's oppression. But and I think the critic Nancy Fraser has kind of summed it up very, very well when she talks about what happens between the 1970s and the early 21st century. She says that what we've moved from is a politics of redistribution to a politics of recognition. And what does she mean by that? And I think what she's arguing is that mainstream feminism places disproportionate emphasis on things like media images, glass ceilings, and the number of women in political and corporate power. But what they fail to do is look at the politics of redistribution, which is, in other words, how society is organised. They don't look at issues like work, like care, like sexual violence, like the other gender disparities that exist in society. And instead, these issues are configured as personal issues rather than social issues. So one of the things that has happened, I think, over the course of the 4 decades since the second wave feminism is that social struggles have become subordinated in favour of cultural struggles, or struggles for identity, to be seen and to have a kind of cultural and social role in society. What is rarely addressed by mainstream feminism is the economic inequalities and how they feed into kind of wider questions about social and cultural inequalities. And I think just want to just use the last kind of few minutes that I have just to kind of think, look at kind of some of the explanations for that. And I think part of it has to be in the nature of kind of late 20th century, early 21st century capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, which has one of the key, I think, strategies of neoliberalism has been, one of the key strategies for managing opposition is to divert kind of political and economic struggles into cultural channels. And I think the other thing is that one thing I've been doing for the last few months is reading some of the kind of very early kind of feminist manifestos of the 1960s and 1970s. And even though I know as a Marxist I'd have a lot of disagreements with them, but the one thing that I find is really, really striking about them is the sense of ambition The sense that if we wanted to fight for women's liberation, that you had to not just address yourself personally, but that it involved a transformation of the whole of society. That to give women access to things like, access to creches, access to a decent social services, supports for having children in society, that involved not just getting a couple of scoring a couple of victories in the struggle, but it involved a whole transformation of the nature of society and how society was organised. What has happened in those 4 decades, though, is that rather than looking at the whole of society, I think there has been an over-focus on things like access to paid work or to access to the kind of levers of capitalist power. And it's quite clear that there has been, in those 4 decades, a series of women who have done very, very well out of feminism. People like Hillary Clinton have done incredibly well out of feminism. And in some ways, feminism has achieved everything that they set out to gain. So now that Hillary Clinton is now talked about as a serious contender for the presidency. That sort of mainstream feminism has been more interested in accommodating itself to capitalism rather than actually challenging the system. And I think one of the very interesting things that has happened is that that women today in the kind of 21st century, that a woman is almost the ideal neoliberal subject, because she's self-managing, she's self-disciplining, she's flexible, and she does a huge amount of unpaid labour. The equivalent, if you think about the unpaid labour, the United Nations estimate that the work that women do in the home, domestic work, care work, that is equivalent to $3 trillion. The amount of unpaid work that women do. So in some ways, women are the ideal neoliberal subjects, because they are, because of the kind of the society that we live in, that they are encouraged to regulate every aspect of their behaviour, how they look, how they feel, how they think, how they act, and to present all of those actions as freely chosen. These are my own personal choices. So women are, in some ways, the ideal neoliberal subjects. And at the same time, I think feminism is not just, and I mean kind of mainstream feminism, is not just an expression of neoliberalism, but in some ways, and I think this has particularly come quite acute in the context of the crisis, that feminism has become itself kind of constitutive of neoliberalism. And I want to spend just a minute or two explaining what I mean by that, because there is a whole series of if you've kind of been following, thank you, if you've been there's a whole. One of the things that in the last couple of years is if you look at things like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, various kind of projects by big multinational corporations, there has been this huge focus on the figure of the girl. Okay, and in Davos in 2010, in that kind of meeting where the kind of great and good from capitalism gather, in 2010 the theme was the focus on the girl. The IMF website slogan, if you look on the IMF website, is "Empowering women is smart economics." Goldman Sachs, one of those kind of big corporate hedge funds, has, if you look on their kind of webpage, has a whole series of economic predictions for if you invest in girls, if you invest in their education, in their health, how much of a return that this will give to global capitalism. Nike, that great employer of women in sweatshops in Southeast Asia, has set up a foundation called the Girl Effect. And they want to empower women to join the workforce, to leave home, presumably, I'm assuming, to work in the sweatshops for less than $1 a day that Nike and their subcontractors employ them. But they have, they have a whole big website. They've devoted millions, hundreds of millions, to empowering women. So there's a whole kind of series within kind of NGO groups, kind of mainstream economics, that keep talking about the economic benefits to capitalism of empowering women. And it also, I think, kind of feeds into the kind of into an imperialism of kind of wealthy countries who seek to kind of justify and disguise a lot of their imperialist adventures as the liberation of women. Most famously, you know, in Iraq and Afghanistan, they didn't go in to, you know, conquer and take all the oil reserves out of Iraq. No, they went in to liberate the women of cover, to quote George Bush. And there's a whole language around, and there was a whole, you know, feminism, you know, very happily joined the bandwagon during the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and continue to justify imperialist interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq and other parts of the Middle East by using the kind of the guise of these imperialist interventions, that it's not about imperialism, no, it's about liberating women. And we see all this stuff about ISIS as well. You know, there's all these stories coming out, no doubt a lot of them are true, about what ISIS are doing to women. But I don't think you just have to look to ISIS and look to the Middle East, to what's happening to women. You can look in your own back garden, and you can see the kind of reality of oppression, the sexual violence that women in America experience. So this kind of empowerment of individual women is, I think, quite closely connected to the ideology of neoliberalism. So that neoliberalism has this kind of unparalleled ability to commodify everything from workers' rights to sexuality. And we have things like the rise of raunch culture, which again kind of wraps itself in the language and vocabulary of women's sexual freedom. And women's sexual freedom is completely delinked from any notion of inequality, which again makes perfect sense within the kind of framework of neoliberalism. It's all about you as an individual, your responsibility, your personal choices. So just finally, in the last minute or so, I think we don't want to just focus just on questions of culture, and to leave other kind of key questions like how cultures are, how they're produced and how they can be changed untouched. Because I think Marxists argue that capitalism, or that culture, is rooted in material reality. That is how a society is structured to meet our basic needs, how that system works, how people go to work, how they produce things, how they live their lives. And under capitalism today, everything is privatized within the kind of structured within the kind of private nuclear family. And even within that, so much of the care work that would have even been done within the nuclear family is itself privatized under capitalism. So when you think about all the social functions of our society are privatized within the family, the raising of the next generation, the basic kind of day-to-day care that allows us to get up, to go to work, to care for children, to care for the elderly. All of this is the responsibility of the individual. It may be privatized under capitalism, but the individual family, still has to pay for that. It is not the kind of, it's not coming out of a welfare state. So historically, that responsibility falls to women, and even though women are a permanent feature of the workforce, the expectation is still that women will continue to do that care work. And even if the nuclear family or the traditional family has changed, society continues to be structured as if the nuclear family is at the centre of that. So I think the Marxist explanation for women's oppression has to lie within capitalism and within the family itself. And if we want to fight for real liberation and meaningful liberation, it means that we have to challenge those structures, and fundamentally we have to challenge the nature of capitalism itself.
Okay, does anybody want to chip in with a comment, a question, ask anything you like? I think Sinead's given us a huge amount to think about. And I saw various people sort of around the room react, having various thoughts as the talk was going on. Chrissy?
Thank you for that, Sinead. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm Chrissy Gardner. I'm Assistant Branch Secretary for Unite Bristol Health Services Branch. I'm delighted today that 3 of us from our branch attended this event, which is Gwyneth Pardoes and Shukri Sheikhali, who was in the meeting earlier but had to leave. I just wanted to share really my experience of being a female trade union activist over the last year or so. July last year, my branch stood out against a disciplinary procedure that was levied against our low-paid staff. The low-paid staff at Band 1s. It's the lowest pay in the South West region. The neighbouring trusts all pay their staff at Band 2. And the largest proportion of people in that banding are women and people, ethnic minorities. So I was approached by some of the members and I wrote a letter to support them. But I was immediately suspended by a bloke who was a regional secretary. But I was actually off sick while they suspended me, while my son was in hospital having emergency surgery, life-changing surgery. So the issue had kicked off in July and I'd gone off sick in August. And I was suspended in October, so they certainly didn't want me to come back. And then it was another bloke who suspended me in collusion with the regional secretary at a national level in Holborn. So that was really very traumatic actually, as a woman, a female activist fighting against a ridiculous policy that sees a member of staff, a woman, being sacked if you're 12 minutes late in a rolling 12-month period. Because if you're 1 minute late 3 times, you go to a disciplinary hearing. So that's appalling. So I felt we needed to speak out about that, and I did. It's not the end, because I've been allowed to seek re-election now. I have appealed the decision that suspended me and kicked me off the national committee, but we're coming back for certain because people have signed up to my nomination. But I just thought it was such an oppressive thing to do to a woman. We're not really overabundance of women fighting in Unite the Union, especially in the health sector. It's a new emerging sector, and we only have 100,000 members. And despite putting in a 40-page report to the 2 blokes that suspended me, saying, why their industrial strategy for improving density in that area was wrong and not working, they still suspended me. So, but I'm coming back. I've got 40 people on my nomination sheet, and we're coming back because I'm worth it.
Thank you, Chrissy.
Oh, sorry, and please sign up to the Unite the Resistance, because that's our next initiative that Unite Health Branch are actually sponsoring, and we'd love to have you on board with that.
Who's next? Yes, Nick, fire away.
Just a couple of points really. What the speaker was saying about how, in some ways, neoliberal capitalism or feminism has, in the eyes of some feminists, they've got what they want in terms of neoliberal capitalism, and talking about you're talking about Facebook and Yahoo and the sort of the way individual women are treated and the way individual women can get senior management. But I think the way to look at it is really not point at those individual examples, but however many examples like that you have, however many Hillary Clintons, however many Margaret Thatchers there are in the world, if look at it another way, looking at the news today, there's the whole business of an equal pay dispute going on in Asda, where basically they've been getting away with not paying equal pay for men and women doing equivalent work for decades, 40 years since the Equal Pay Act, and hopefully there'll be some for a lot of money. If you look at it another way, individual women who might say they find things like pole dancing empowering, for example, however many individuals say that, or page 3 pin-ups in the Sun who say they find it empowering, however many individual examples of that there are, looking at it another way, how many women suffer, how many people suffer from body image problems, mental health issues arising from body image problems, and eating disorders arising from mental health issues arising from body image problems, and it is disproportionately women. And those examples surely indicate however many individual cases of women who've made it or feel empowered by it, there's a huge problem of institutional sexism, which is really what we're talking about, I think.
Thank you very much. Who else would like to chip in? Jackie.
Yeah, I'm not.
And then Sharon.
I want to speak. In terms of I think Pete is absolutely right. I think the essence of it is when it comes to women and women in this society particularly, the centerpiece is sexism and the centerpiece is sexuality. I applaud the feminist movement for the advances over the last couple of hundred of years in terms of pay, although I still feel we're not there yet. I think there are new issues now which have arisen in terms of pay. Why do I say that? I'm a midwife. I've been a midwife for, I can't even remember how long, I've stopped counting, it might be 13 years. I've worked in loads of different maternity units in London, and I currently work up at St Michael's here. There's been a change since I've been a midwife over the last 13, 15 years. The majority of women when I started that were having babies were married, they're now single mums. I don't have an issue with that, I don't have a problem with that. That is their choice, but it's mothers having children for different fathers and how those fathers relate to them as women and the issues that they have to face on a day-to-day basis. These women, they having the babies, they're crushed. They're crushed in terms of support. Does society support them? You know, because basically having a child, you have a child and it's nice up until about the age of 5, and then that child then goes out to be prepared to serve society, and therefore I feel that society owes women in that sense. You know, working class kids, they're the ones that are filling the armies to go out and support and fight all these different wars that are going on everywhere. So I feel that society owes it to women to support them. The majority of women on the wards up there now are single women having children, and if you're challenged, as Pete said, in any way, mentally or physically, it can totally wreck your life. Teenage girls, Asian girls having babies as well. We've got all of that to face, and all the abnormalities that are going on as well with children. You know, the support for women isn't there. We've had a female Prime Minister, Hillary Clinton, we've had Margaret Thatcher in this country, done and dusted. What difference has that really made to women today in the workforce? I think next to nothing. She didn't support women. I think she had, what was it, Edwina Currie, but she chucked her out in the end, you know, and she made basically next to no contribution to women in the workforce at all. I can't see any record of it. And anyway, in society as well, I think there's a problem in terms of supporting women for creche facilities, but we've covered that already. Breastfeeding and how breastfeeding is seen. In terms of educating those girls that I work with up there, that just as been highlighted, they do have a problem with how they see their bodies. I grew up around African and Jamaican, Caribbean women. We just think we're fabulous, you know. Put it all out there. And Jamaica is a matriarchal society. It's very much, the families are very much organised by women, and strong women at that, descendants from slavery. You know, and women are celebrated, and I think one of the things in British society is that women are not celebrated. How fantastic, a man gives you a seed or a few little seeds, you create this thing, you carry this thing for 9 months, you go through sickness, you go through having a double mind, you know, when you're pregnant you go through a spate of madness, and you do, and people don't recognise it in the first few weeks of your pregnancy, and you've got to behave as if everything's fine, and you're sitting there having a cup of coffee, but you don't want a cup of coffee because actually you feel like spewing out that cup of coffee. You know, your body image is altering and changing. You can't run up and down and function, and everybody expects you to function normally. But you try carrying a 5 pound sack of potatoes around for about 9 months, and you'll soon see a bit of a difference. You know, your body image, it affects you physically, it affects you psychologically, it affects you financially, it affects every relationship you have on every single level. You know, you're fine in the workplace until you're pregnant. You're fine anywhere as a woman until you are pregnant or become elderly. That's another issue. Or challenged in some way, because women are, there's no doubt about it, women are oppressed. And I have a problem with the teenagers up there, because they don't, empowerment is lacking, and I see it very much when it comes to breastfeeding. They don't think they can do, you know, and they don't think I don't think women's bodies are fabulous. You have a little seed, you carry this little seed for 9 months, you put that, when I watch women having forceps delivery, cesarean sections, when I watch and see what women have to go through, and then within a space of a few weeks you're expected to be back out there operating in the workforce naturally, and you can see the change in the women, you can see the change in the midwives when they come back, to have to be getting up at like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning to organise the nappies, to organise everything else, as well as come back into work and function absolutely normal, up to speed, all the studying that is required, the same as everything else. And there is a fundamental in society lack of support of women and value in women with children or without children. I just want to note that.
Thank you very much. Kay. Sorry. Sharon was next, then Kay.
Now, I have to say, I looked up differently.
No, I'm going
pregnancy.
sorry, I should have said Sharon's next. I slipped up there. Sharon's next, and then Kay.
Oh, okay. I've got stepchildren. I'm really glad. I'm the easy way. I like the ready-made goods. It's much easier, obviously.
I've got the step-parents parachute guide book.
What was I going to say? Oh yeah, something that Sinead said in her introduction about the ambitiousness of feminism in the 60s, and I like that, and I was thinking, why does it seem different from the sort of feminism of now? And I think it's the context it was in, wasn't it? Because you think about the 60s, you know, there was sort of a revolution in the air. You had France in '68. You had workers on the streets. You had Black Power movement in America, and feminism learnt from all this and was in part of it. And so all the demands really were stemmed from that. So it wasn't just limited, I think, through the women's eyes. Just wasn't about women. It was about a better family, so creches and abortion on demand and all those things. So you've got to look at it in context. But when that movement then died back, then the feminist demands or the ambitions, I think, retreated, because then it becomes the analysis that rather than class being the major division in society, the division is between men and women. And I think for me, I mean, when I was a student years ago, I used to have a problem with the feminists, because I thought, if you think half the world is the enemy, how the hell are you going to change it? It really just didn't make sense to me, and I think that the problem with patriarchy is that it's the focus is wrong, and more importantly, it doesn't show you how we can win, because the whole thing for me is unity, which is why I get a bit frustrated with the guys downstairs, because when we're faced with what we're faced with, whether it's the war and the Tories or UKIP, we need to be uniting on the left, don't we, really, and looking at who the enemy is, not each other. But however, and the solidarity and collectivity of men and women fighting together as a class, I think, is far more powerful. And I'll leave it there.
Kay.
Yeah, a couple of things really. I think I had a slightly different experience of pregnancy than you. I had a very positive one. However, the fact it's so idealised in society, I think, does feed into the difference or potential different treatment of men and women. And I think the greatest sort of attack on women, it really does sort of stem from capitalism, from growing up as a child, going into, as you said, if you go into the education system, and certainly at the moment with the education system, being privatised more and more and creating even more divisions, reintroducing racism through the curriculum, through the structures, through the attacks on the unions as well. The messages that men and women are given very much at the moment is that undervalue them, individualise them as well. And there's an experience. I've been teaching sociology A-level this week and doing exactly that, looking at the changing or the perceived changed images of women from the 60s to now. And we did a straw poll of people in the class, and it was very, very interesting. It was a combination of features from the 1960s and 70s, family, identity, career, but they're definitely now what the women in the group wanted. They wanted education, they wanted independence, they expected a career. They also wanted to have a right to a free and enjoyable and self-fulfilling sexual life as well. But what happened last week is in the year 12 they had speakers in, and some of the boys wolf-whistled at a woman that was speaking, and that was immediately challenged by the girls in the sixth form who were, absolutely shocked at this behaviour and took that on board. So that was a really very, very positive stand in itself. But another interesting thing in the school, we're just moving from being academised, we're going to be academised, the head teacher is gone, he is a man. He's probably, and I hate to say, as managers go, he's not the worst, but the new manager is going to be a woman who pretty much is horrific. I think she's akin to the woman that was head teacher in Bath, an absolute bully. And it's a very clear example there. It's not the gender of the individual which is the factor, which is going to discriminate people, is going to attack workers' conditions. It is their politics, and it's their politics, which clearly are embedded in, capitalist policies. And we had got to a point in the school we're in where we were on the fringe of taking action. We're still going to take action. The head left yesterday. The new head starts on Monday after half term, and that was a surprise appointment. But already the action's been toned down by some of the members of the union who were in bed with the managers. But we're going to be taking action after half term. But it's clearly, as you say, it's the capitalism which it does in the end of the day, not just attack women, but destroys men as well. And we need to unite and fight against all of the factors which are holding us back as a working class.
Okay, we've probably got another few minutes, so I'd like contributions to be kept short now. Chuck at the back, Dave.
Partly following on actually from that, and I was just wondering about the theme, which often still doesn't come up maybe enough when we have these meetings about women's oppression, which is about the very complex, intricate link between women's oppression and alienation. That's an important argument about why it is about men as well as women, and it's about the wider sort of capitalist sort of picture of what's going on, and why you can't dislocate and talk about men as sexist, for example, outside what the system does to them. So I'm thinking one of the many examples actually is a very interesting topic. Possibly is something like pornography, for example, where I think this is deeply about women being reduced to sexual objects and sexualised every element of their lives. The erasure of someone's total personality and character in the process, but also the notion of capitalism creating the customers for pornography. I'm thinking particularly most immediately of, say, the male customers of it, is a profound one. And I'm thinking about alienation here as this process of deep, powerlessness, a sense of utter meaninglessness, purpose being sucked out of life, really, and leading to people being absolutely hollowed out. And what this means in terms of, say, the draw of pornography as some sort of, irresistible enticement, for whatever the deep sort of seated psychological reasons, but nonetheless very, very profound. And so hence you have to see them both together. Likewise, just jump to something like Rotherham and the scandal of the abuse of the care home victims. Again, if you look at the actual abusers, people in the nighttime economy, other people profoundly alienated themselves, and then the victims, of course, who are attacked from sort of the very start of their lives, really, through abuse themselves. The two have to be seen together. Final thing is, if anyone's seen the film Pride, you see a real sense about how central alienation is to issues around family, homophobia, sexism, in the process of struggle, and how the process of struggle, fighting alienation, is about challenging those ideas, but the two have to be seen together. So there's a constant close relationship to alienation and women's oppression.
Okay, somebody at the back.
I'm a young woman myself.
Could you speak up, because some of us are old and deaf.
I'm a young woman myself, and I find that there's a lot of oppression that I'm dealing with. I find it so impossible that so many young women have to make so many choices, really hard choices, really quickly. And I don't like the amount of pressure, especially for unemployed women. Back in the days when a woman could get married and she would be supported, I think even though it was less exciting for women and perhaps less empowering in some aspects, at least there was that stability in a sense. And I certainly feel a lot of anxieties because I don't have a perfect CV, I'm unemployed, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life, and I don't even know if there's a way in which I can find a job again, and I find that very, very hard.
To everybody who's contributed, I think every single contribution brought in something new to think about and something very important. So I'm going to ask Sinead to take 5 minutes to come back.
Yeah. Well, it's very hard, I think, to add to what you said at the end, because I think that was, a great. You articulated it really well. I think the reality for, millions of women around the world that we're told under capitalism, we're offered all of these choices. We're told we can do anything, we can be anything, but for the majority of us, I think the experience of capitalism is not one of infinite choice, but particularly under austerity is the repeated closing down of all of these choices. That increasingly it's difficult to go to university because of the fees. Even if you do go to university, there is no guarantee of a job at the end of it. If you don't go to university, it's more difficult to get a job. There are huge pressures, I think, on women to look a certain way, to behave a certain way. There are all of these demands, and I think for a lot of young women, I think that feels incredibly oppressive, and it is incredibly difficult. I think it affects women in particular ways, but I think it probably it affects all young people. Sorry.
Definitely.
Yeah. No, I just think it affects women in particular ways, but I think we can also see that we hear. The man at the back talked about the experience of alienation that so many young people experience. I mean, I'm always quite shocked. I work in a university, and just particularly in the couple of years, so many students coming in with mental health problems. Just it's sometimes overwhelming, and you just see how much they're struggling. They're trying to study full time. They're trying to work full time. They have family problems, and then they're struggling with depression and mounting debt. And it is just so difficult for them. And and I think increasingly they see very little kind of light at the end of the tunnel, because there are no jobs. I know certainly in my own country where there's kind of been very brutal austerity as there has been here. But when this is put to the government politicians, they're basically told the best thing you can do is emigrate, go to Australia, go to America. You're right, there's no hope here, just leave. And they can't wait to get rid of young people because they want to massage the unemployment figures. And this is the response publicly and it's we have a kind of coalition of the Labour Party and a kind of conservative Fine Gael party. But this is the Labour Minister for Education is saying to young people, leave the country. There's nothing for you here. And I think that is the reality for young people, for men and women under capitalism.
In this way, I feel that it's very short-sighted.
Yeah.
Because I'm a young person, and I'm going to be the the future.
Yeah, yeah.
Collectively with other young people, of course.
Yeah.
And I don't want. I suffer terribly from mental health problems. For me to be here today took quite a lot because I'm going through an incredibly tough time. But the fact is, I am here, and I'm here to say that things need to change because I don't want there to be more young people like me who can't even get up in the mornings and don't even know how to feel any self-worth. That just don't know how to be of use to anyone, of use to themselves, to feel that they have a right to be a part of the world.
I'm going to let Sinead finish now because.
Well, I think she,
an
I think she's sort
contribution.
of saying it better than I could. You're
Yes.
expressing, I think it very, very, very well, just how difficult it is. And I think that's why a socialist, that it's not, what I think is very important about socialism, it doesn't look for individual solutions, that it's not about you as an individual, how you're failing in some way, that it's about the wider questions, about the society, and that it isn't about us as individuals acting to stand up to the system, but it's how we collectively can act together, and that we can find strength and solidarity by acting together. And it's only when I think we come together collectively that we become empowered, and that collectively, that's why I think as socialists that we talk about the working class, we talk about how we act not as individuals, but how we act as a class to collectively challenge the system, because the system functions as an entity, as a collective of power, and therefore I think when we come together, we are stronger, we're bigger, and we're stronger, and that system needs us. It can't function without us. Yeah, exactly. And we can, and I think that's always strikes me at the end of Engels on his pamphlet on women's oppression. He talks at the end about a different world of where relationships between men and women are transformed, where the type of world that we live in is completely different. And it's about challenging capitalism, but fighting for a different world in which we all can be who we really are. And it's not about us as individuals, but about fighting collectively, and that we can in some way be our most individual when we work together collectively to challenge capitalism. So thank you so much for your contribution.